22nd of June, 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. He planned a lightning victory, just as he had achieved in the West. When Operation Barbarossa is launched, he declared, the whole world will hold its breath. The scale of operations was vast. The German armies massed along the Soviet frontier that summer of 1941 stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. They represented the greatest concentration of military force the world had ever seen. Hitler had long had plans for Russia. In August 1939, on the eve of the invasion of Poland, he said, I have sent my death's head formations eastwards. Poland will be depopulated and settled with Germans. The fate of Russia will be exactly the same. It was to be nearly 2 years before Hitler was ready to act. In 18 months, his forces had overrun Western Europe, smashing every army that stood in their way. Only Britain held out, for reasons Hitler was still unable to comprehend. But there was nothing to stop Germany now. On that 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler launched the greatest invasion in military history. 3 million German and Axis troops in 3 army groups attacked the Russian border from the Baltic coast to the Romanian frontier. More than 150 divisions were mobilized, including 19 panzer divisions, 1,945 German aircraft, and another 1,000 Axis planes. They faced some 3 million men of the Red Army, which had another 1 million soldiers deployed across southern republics of the USSR and in the Far East, where they had recently beaten the Japanese in a series of border clashes. The Russians were taken by surprise. Stalin had been determined to do nothing but to provoke a German invasion until he had had a chance to reorganize his own forces. Apparently unable to believe that Hitler would break their cynical alliance so soon, he saw to it that the USSR continued to deliver strategic materials to the Germans right up to the very night of the attack. The Luftwaffe had been overflying Russian air bases for months before the invasion. At least one Russian officer was shot for firing on German photo-reconnaissance planes that blamed navigational errors for their intrusion. Now, it scored the greatest victory in its history, wiping out the Red Air Force in a matter of days. Soviet bases were in the process of expansion, so many air regiments were doubled up on the airstrips. Aircraft were packed together where a single bomb could destroy a whole squadron. If they got into the air, the Russians had neither the skill nor the aircraft to challenge the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and many German fighter pilots began to run up incredible numbers of victories. By the time the attack was launched in mid-June, enough fuel, ammunition and stores had been stockpiled to supply this vast force in a 600-kilometer advance. 500,000 lorries waited in massed parks from East Prussia to Romania to rush those supplies forward on demand. To the modern mind, the only questionable, indeed alarming figure to emerge from the tables of statistics is that for stabling. 300,000 horses were to play an apparently essential part in this monumental military exercise. Under the command of the icily aristocratic Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, Army Group Center comprised 2 infantry armies and 2 panzer groups, in effect tank armies, under Generals Hoth and Guderian. These were the armies whose commanders intended to reduce Napoleon's feat of arms of 129 years earlier to historical obscurity. They planned to reach Moscow in less than 8 weeks and to annihilate the Soviet army in the process. In this hope they were encouraged by Hitler, who had assured them Before 3 months have passed, we shall witness a collapse in Russia, the like of which has never been seen in history. We have only to kick in the front door, and the whole rotten Russian edifice will come tumbling down. To Heinz Guderian, whose Panzergruppe II included 4 panzer divisions, this was the supreme moment of his military career. It was evident that he and Hoth, between them, commanded the most significant forces in the entire operation, and could well execute the most exciting and spectacular military feat of the century, perhaps of all history. And the first few days seemed to confirm the prospect. Guderian's first task was to throw his Panzergruppe across the river Bug on each side of the fortress of Brest-Litovsk, capture the fortress, and then race with his armored spearheads towards the city of Minsk. He would curve up to it from the south to meet Hoth's spearheads coming down from the north. In this way, the Soviet frontline forces would be isolated in a huge cauldron. Once their supplies had run out, they would have little alternative but to surrender. This was all achieved in 5 days of breathtaking exhilaration, which seemed to confirm Hitler's pronouncement and the optimism of the Wehrmacht leaders. By the 24th of June, only 60 hours after the launch of the attack, 17th Panzer Division was driving into Slonim, over 140 kilometers from the frontier and halfway to the Germans' first objective. 3 days later, on the afternoon of the 27th of June, the leading tanks of the 17th Panzer Division drove into Minsk to meet the spearheads of Hoth's 3rd Panzergruppe, which had covered 350 kilometers in 5 days. But behind them they had left pockets of Soviet troops who, unlike most of the French army the year before, showed little inclination to lay down their arms and surrender. There were 4 of these pockets: the fortress at Brest-Litovsk, 6 divisions around Bialystok, 6 more at Volkovisk, and another 15 between Novogrudok and Minsk itself. The task of first containing and then destroying them was assigned to the German infantry of the 4th and 9th armies. The trouble was that the infantry, trudging stolidly after the panzer divisions, were now quite a long way behind. The roads shown on the Barbarossa maps proved in the majority of cases to be little but dirt tracks, which were quickly reduced to calf-deep dust, through which it was impossible to move at more than 5 kilometers per hour. Not surprisingly, arguments arose. Guderian and Hoth were convinced that they must immediately race further ahead, first to Smolensk and then to Moscow, confident that speed would prove the decisive factor in this campaign. On the 1st of July, in a burst of insubordination, the 2 panzer commanders released units towards the next obstacle, the river Berezina. They were threatened with court-martial for so doing by their immediate superior, General Gunther von Kluge. On the same day, Guderian's panzers met for the first time the Soviet T-34. A single tank blocked their advance for 3 hours, knocking out 5 Panzer IIIs. It was only removed when attacked from the rear by an 88mm flak gun. Fortunately for the Germans, no more T-34s were encountered in the area. On the 3rd of July, the order came for the next stage of the advance. From his illicit bridgehead over the Berezina, Guderian launched the 18th Panzer Division towards the river Dnieper, which was reached on the 5th of July. Here the division beat off a Soviet counterattack and then waited until all 3 of the Panzergruppe Corps were lined up along the river. It was not a safe position. Both flanks were exposed. The supply organization was becoming increasingly tenuous, and the support infantry was 2 weeks hard marching behind them. No wonder Kluge remonstrated violently, and at first expressly forbade any attempt at further advance. But every day that the Germans waited, the Soviet defenses would stiffen, until the task of crossing the Dnieper would become impossible for anything less than an army group. Eventually Kluge gave way. "Your operations always hang by a thread," he muttered, but gave permission for the next stage. The next 3 weeks were occupied with the hardest fighting the Germans had yet experienced. For 10 days, 2nd Panzergruppe had 3 separate objectives to pursue. It was to bar the Soviet forces they had bypassed from escape south or east. At the same time, it was to make contact with 3rd Panzergruppe fighting their way down from the northwest. Finally, it was to widen the German hold on the land east of Smolensk, turning it into a solid bridgehead for the final thrust towards Moscow. Although advance units of the 29th Motorized Division reached Smolensk on the 16th of July, fierce fighting still raged behind them, and there was as yet no sign of Hoth's 3rd Panzergruppe spearheads. But on the 29th of July, Hitler's adjutant, Colonel Schmundt, arrived at Guderian's headquarters, bringing with him Hitler's felicitations and the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. Guderian was only the 5th man in the army to receive them. He also brought with him the first hint of changes of plan and emphasis. Moscow was perhaps not so important after all. The rolling wheatlands of the Ukraine would provide the granary from which the ever-growing Axis armies could be fed. Moreover, down in that direction lay the Baku oil fields. Moscow could wait. Guderian, for the moment, must go no further east. While Army Group Center drove towards Moscow, Field Marshal von Lieb's Army Group North was aimed at the Baltic States and Leningrad. Group North consisted of 2 infantry armies containing 15 infantry divisions between them. The armored punch was provided by the 4th Panzergruppe, which comprised of 3 panzer divisions, 3 motorized infantry divisions, and 2 infantry divisions. 3 further divisions were held in support. The fact that they had less of the Wehrmacht's mobile striking power than Army Group Center was a matter of some irritation to von Lieb's staff. After all, they had further to go, and on paper, a much deeper enemy defense to penetrate. The differences did not extend to the 2 principals themselves, von Lieb and von Bock, who were far too aristocratic to squabble, though they encouraged their subordinates to do so. By midnight, on the 21st, 22nd of June, every unit was in position. At 3:05 a.m. on the morning of the 22nd, Army Group North began the drive towards Leningrad. The only early resistance encountered by the vital central thrust was quickly brushed aside, and by the evening of the first day, the leading panzers were 60 kilometers into Lithuania. 7th Panzer Division was racing along the main road from Kaunas to Daugavpils-Dvinsk on the river Dvina. By the morning of the 26th, they had captured the 2 river bridges there. Counterattacks were beaten off. More panzers came roaring in, and by the end of the day, the city was firmly in German hands. The first objective of Army Group North, bridgeheads across the wide river Dvina, 300 kilometers from East Prussia, had been achieved in 5 days. On the 2nd of July, the Panzergruppe set out on the 250-kilometer race to the Ostrov-Pskov area. 1st Panzer Division captured Ostrov on the 4th of July. 6th Panzer Division smashed away through the northern extension of the Stalin Line on the same day, and 3 motorized divisions of the Panzergruppe had crossed the old Latvian-Russian border opposite Opochka and were also driving up towards Pskov. When on the 5th of July the mass of Soviet tanks held to the east was thrown into a counterattack, German armor had been thoroughly reinforced. By the end of the second day, only the wrecks of 140 Soviet tanks lay between the Panzer divisions and Pskov itself. But the Panzergruppe's infantry could not keep up. The terrain encountered on the Soviet side of the border was so marshy and impenetrable that even the motorized infantry was reduced to the pace of the marching columns, and they were just clearing Daugavpils over 100 kilometers back. Things moved more quickly to the west. The roads in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia were so much better than those in Russia that the 18th Army was moving almost as fast as the panzers. By the 7th of July, 12 Soviet divisions had been destroyed. both Tallinn and Narva were under artillery fire, and 4 divisions were driving towards the southern end of Lake Peipus. To the commanders back in Germany, and to Hitler especially, the picture across the whole Barbarossa front was one of increasing danger. Not only were the gaps opening between armor and infantry, they were also gaping widely between the army groups themselves. Even though the Soviet forces in these gaps ranged from confused to chaotic, they consisted of an apparently unlimited number of brave soldiers who seemed incapable of realizing when they were beaten. The German infantry had to catch up with the panzers. This would ensure a stable platform from which to launch the next stages of the invasion. Despite the anguished pleas of the panzer commanders Reinhardt and Manstein, the idea of an immediate thrust into the heart of Leningrad would have to wait. Behind them, the infantry fought and marched again, and gradually their strength waned. Casualties were inevitably suffered, and battalions, regiments, even divisions had to be left behind to deal with pockets of resistance. Then in mid-July, the orders came for units to be detached from the northern wing of Army Group Center to fill the ominous gap between the two groups. The delay gave the Russian defenders the opportunity to strengthen their positions enormously. The German attack northwards was checked west of Lake Ilmen, largely by another immutable factor of warfare. After more than a month of constant fighting and forced marches, often in great heat, German infantrymen were suffering mounting exhaustion. The assault ran into a Red Army counterattack. The storm of fire that erupted stunned both sides. Eventually, however, German training and efficiency prevailed. 4 panzer divisions broke through, and by the 11th of August were clear yet again for the drive on Leningrad, only to be held back by stiff Russian resistance. Hitler now ordered Army Group Center to release one of General Hoth's Panzer Corps to help Army Group North. Driving up the west bank of the Volkhov, its leading tank units reached Ishora, only 17 kilometers from the center of Leningrad. Its motorized infantry swung up to the east towards the river Neva and the shores of Lake Ladoga. The old capital of Russia was now surrounded, but not yet occupied. The 2 leading divisions were soon enmeshed in a labyrinth of anti-tank ditches and straggling earthworks thrown up by the desperate Leningraders while the Germans had paused to regroup. By the evening of the 10th of September, German units had reached the Dubadov Heights, 10 kilometers southeast of the city. But so many panzers had been hit or had broken down that the momentum of attack had been dissipated. German infantry crept up on their left during the following day, entered the Leningrad suburbs of Slutsk and Pushkin, and in the evening occupied the summer palace of the Tsars at Krasnoye Selo. But the impetus had gone. And by now the lure of the wheat lands of the Ukraine and the Baku oil fields had taken complete control of Hitler's mind. Like Moscow, Leningrad must wait. There is some irony in the fact that by August 1941, Hitler had decided that the southern front of Barbarossa was the most important. For in order to capture it, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had originally been given command of the weakest army group. His most powerful forces were in the north, 6th Army under Reichenau, 1st Panzergruppe under Kleist, and 17th Army under Strup-Nagel. In the south, driving out of Moldavia, a single German army was accompanied by 2 Romanian armies, a Hungarian army corps, and an Italian army corps, all armed with obsolete equipment and with a bare minimum of artillery and vehicles. The attack made excellent progress from the start. The Russian commander, General Kimponos, committed his forces piecemeal as they became available. They were all destroyed in turn, though this was not the end of early resistance. In their first powerful thrust, 1st Panzergruppe had shouldered the Russian 5th Army aside and into the Pripet marshes, where neither German armor nor vehicles could follow. With the astonishing resilience typical of bypassed Soviet troops, 5th Army reorganized. and in mid-July struck southwest from Kolosten towards the Soviet 6th Army driving up from below Berdichov. German expertise and their skillful use of the 88mm flak gun in an anti-tank role broke this attempt to snap off the invading spearhead, but 5th Army then retreated back into the marshes. For the next 6 weeks, both Kleist and Reichenau were uncomfortably aware of the threat hanging over their shoulders. But the main drive continued down between the Bug and the Dniester. The main Soviet forces, commanded by the flamboyant but incompetent Marshal Budeny and his political commissar Nikita Khrushchev, concentrated around two important centers, Kiev and Uman. Avoiding both by cutting between them, Kleist's Panzergruppe with 6th Army in close attendance drove down the land bridge between the rivers, and part of Reichenau's forces headed west. There they were joined first by Stumpfnagel's divisions and then by Schaubert's coming up from Moldavia. The ground was much harder here than further north, so infantry could move more quickly. The Russian 6th and 12th Armies and part of the 18th were thus isolated between overwhelming forces. By the 3rd of August, they had been sealed in. By the 8th, they were being subjected to heavy artillery fire from every side. 2 days later, their resistance ceased. Some 20 Russian divisions had been annihilated and 103,000 prisoners taken. Meanwhile, the two Romanian armies had marched along the coast and begun a siege of Odessa. Although it was to cost the Romanians dearly, the 64-day siege prevented the large Russian garrison from playing a part in the drama unfolding in the heart of the Ukraine. Here, the largest concentration of Red Army troops lay at Kiev and in the area immediately to the north. On Hitler's orders, Guderian's Panzergruppe was now driving down to meet Kleist, thus cutting off 3 complete Russian armies and the remnants of at least 2 more. Guderian had not, in fact, immediately obeyed the Führer, because his eyes and wholehearted ambition were still focused on Moscow. On the 4th of August, Hitler traveled forward to Novorossiysk and talked to his senior commanders. For the moment, he was sufficiently impressed by the arguments of Bock and Guderian not to insist upon the abandonment of the drive on Moscow. But during the next 3 weeks, his attitude hardened, and on the 24th of August, in a solitary interview with Guderian, he ordered him to lead his entire Panzergruppe down to assist in the occupation of the Ukraine. During the next 2 days, Panzergruppe Guderian, as it had been renamed as a sop to Guderian's feelings, swung its axis through 90 degrees and headed south. A new army group, the Bryansk Front, had been formed by the Red Army Command Stavka, with the specific aim of attacking Guderian's flank as it moved south. This reflected the arrival of General Zhukov, who was already exhibiting his uncanny gift for divining an enemy's plans. Unfortunately, Marshal Shaposhnikov, the Red Army Chief of Staff, believed that Moscow was still Guderian's objective. He thus ordered the most powerful elements of the Bryansk Front to stay in the north, so they were unavailable to attack Guderian. Nonetheless, 2 armies of the Bryansk Front, under General Yeremenko, moved forward on the 30th of August to attack Guderian's left flank. Lack of coordination, and more importantly, of air cover, the Red Air Force had by now been virtually annihilated, left them at the mercy of the Germans. By the 2nd of September, Bryansk Front was in tatters, and 8 days later, Stalin was receiving direct appeals from Budeny and Khrushchev for permission for their still large but disintegrating forces to be allowed to escape through the rapidly narrowing gap between Kleist and Guderian. Stalin dismissed Budeny and appointed Marshal Timoshenko to preside over the ensuing debacle. During the remaining days that the gap was open, Stalin insisted through Shaposhnikov that all fronts, all armies, all divisions should stand fast where they were. Guderian's panzers met Kleist's at Lockwitzer on the 15th of September. Infantry and guns from 2nd Army to the north and from 17th Army to the south came up to harden the ring. And by the evening of the 17th, the biggest encirclement of the Barbarossa campaign, perhaps the biggest in history, had been formed. That night, permission was at last given for the remnants of the Soviet armies to attempt to break out to the east. But most had too far to go and lacked the heavy mobile equipment to smash through the waiting German ring. Gudeni and Khrushchev were flown out. Major General Bagramian brought out about 50 men, but Kirponos and most of the staff of the Southwest Front and of the 5th Army were killed as they tried to escape, or were rounded up and captured. And with them into graves or prison camps of the most appalling nature went nearly 500,000 Russian soldiers. In terms of numbers, this was the biggest military catastrophe in Russian history. Guderian and Kleist were jubilant. Rundstedt modestly gratified that the greatest single success of German arms had been won by the army group under his command. In that atmosphere of heady euphoria, few remarked that for all their triumphs and all the ground won, something had been lost, and that was time. But Kleist at least was aware that time was passing. With admirable speed he drew his Panzergruppe back south to the area around Dnipropetrovsk. On the 30th of September it erupted from a bridgehead over the Samara at Novomoskovsk and drove down to the Sea of Azov, neatly trapping 3 Soviet armies, while 11th Army, now under command of General von Manstein, drove eastwards along the coast. Another 106,000 prisoners were taken, together with 212 tanks and nearly 700 guns. Rain, wind, and the first snow flurries brought a hint of the white chaos which would soon engulf the whole Russian front. By the end of October, Kleist's Panzergruppe was edging its way slowly into Rostov. Although they did not know it, they were also edging into a Soviet trap. The Soviets had at last learned the effectiveness of the traditional Russian tactic of trading space for time. Many of the units threatened with encirclement at Kharkov had been allowed by Stalin to retreat. They were now being reformed into the Soviet 37th Army in the angle of the Donetsk bend. On the 19th of November, they began to move forward into Rostov, joined by shock troops of the 9th Army. It was the first time in World War II that the Germans had had to face a major enemy attack, prepared and launched after adequate organization. By the 28th of November, 1st Panzergruppe had been squeezed out of Rostov, back through Taganrog to the line of the Neus River. One of the immediate results was Hitler's anger, followed by Rundstedt's resignation. Guderian and Bock were facing a similar situation in front of Moscow. On the 6th of September, Hitler decreed that Moscow would be the next objective. Army Group North's breakneck advance had come to a sudden stop as it entered the swampy forest that surrounded Leningrad. Its Panzergruppe was assigned to Army Group Center, which now had 3/4 of Germany's tank forces at its disposal. In another giant battle of encirclement, Hoth and Höppner's panzers were to bypass Moscow to the north, while Guderian's Panzergruppe passed to the south. The tanks would link up east of Moscow, cutting the Soviet capital off from reinforcements and supplies. Assigned the code name Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow began on the 2nd of October. The Russians had concentrated huge forces to bar the road to their capital, but these were smashed yet again. In 2 more great battles of encirclement, another 650,000 Russians were captured. The citizens of Moscow sensed which way the wind was blowing. Party officials started burning documents, and whole government departments were transferred east. Then Stalin announced that he would be staying. There were three reasons why the wily Soviet leader refused to abandon the Kremlin. First, there was the weather. On the 6th of October, German forces on the Moscow front awoke to find their tanks dusted with snow. Autumnal rains alternated with freezing nights, a seasonal phenomenon known to Russians as the Rasputitsa, literally, time without roads. There were few metalled roads in the USSR. Most were wide dirt strips that now dissolved into a sticky quagmire that even tanks were unable to cross. Germans on foot sank past the top of their jackboots. Airfields became unusable, and the advance ground to a halt. Stalin's second source of confidence came from his spying in Japan, where it was reported Tojo's cabinet had definitely ruled out an attack on the USSR. Japan would attack America instead. The 750,000 Russian soldiers in the Far East were available to reinforce the depleted forces fighting the Germans. Thirdly, the Red Army was replacing its staggering losses with unbelievable speed. 143 new divisions were mobilized between July and December, and 84 of the divisions destroyed in battle were reconstituted. The Rasputitsa lasted for 4 weeks. Then, on the 7th of November, the temperature plunged, and the liquid mud turned rock hard. The German advance began again, with breakthroughs in the south as well as towards Moscow. At the end of the month, the 7th Panzer Division established a bridgehead over the Volga Canal. Its advance elements were soon within 20 kilometers of Moscow, and in the cold, clear winter air, the spires of the Kremlin were visible through binoculars. Daytime temperatures around Moscow varied from -5 to -12 degrees centigrade, and the Germans found it increasingly difficult to keep fighting in the same uniforms they had worn through the baking heat of summer. Supplies of every kind were simply failing to arrive at the front, where battalions were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Panzer divisions counted themselves lucky to have 50 tanks still running. In fact, the German supply network had begun to falter during the great advances of the summer. It proved impossible to sustain the frontline units using the primitive Russian rail and road network. The Russian railways used a wider track than the German rail system, and it took longer than anticipated to convert them. On the 23rd of July, General Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, had reported to Hitler that the Soviet forces facing the Wehrmacht amounted to 93 divisions, of which 13 were armored. Now, on the 1st of December, his estimate had risen to 200 infantry divisions, 35 cavalry divisions, and 40 armored brigades, with at least another 70 mixed divisions deep inside Soviet territory. And 18 divisions of excellently trained, well-equipped and warmly clothed long service troops, with 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft, were on their way to the Moscow front from the Far East. In early December, Stalin reviewed these Siberian divisions in Red Square. From the parade, they moved straight into the front line. The Russians attacked on the 5th of December. The temperatures plummeted to -50 degrees centigrade, and snow lay more than a meter thick in places. Unable to dig in properly, the undermanned German units were torn apart. The few serviceable German tanks were unable to maneuver in these conditions, and the fuel was stuck hundreds of kilometers behind the front. The Luftwaffe was unable to help. Its aircraft took an average of 5 hours to get airborne, even if the ground crews maintained fires under the engines to keep them from freezing. Russia's latest tanks, the T-34 and KV-1, had wide tracks and engines designed to keep running even in Arctic weather. Russian guns and small arms were similarly robust, built to function in snow or mud, and their soldiers wore thickly insulated uniforms. The hitherto victorious German army fell apart. It had suffered some 750,000 casualties between June and December, and losses soared once the full fury of winter descended. The army reported over 100,000 frostbite cases in December alone. Frostbite caused more hospitalization than Russian guns. Hypothermia would soon be killing more. And now Russian attacks were forcing them out of their hard-won positions, causing the German commanders to look over their shoulders and seek safer defenses to the rear. Hitler would have none of this. Haunted by the spectre of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, he would not allow the Wehrmacht to turn its back even momentarily on the Russian capital. Where would they retreat to, he asked. Is it warmer 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers to the west? There would be no retreat. The German army would stand fast, just as it had in World War I. When his commanders protested, he sacked them. The most senior to go was Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief. The former corporal now took personal charge of the war in the east. Also sacked were the other two army commanders, Lieb and Bock, and just before Christmas, Guderian. 35 corps divisional commanders were likewise dismissed, and Höppner, who had commanded the 4th Panzergruppe in the north, was cashiered, then called back into the army as a private. Only Rundstedt, for whom Hitler to the end had great respect, was allowed to resign. For a time it seemed as though the all-conquering Wehrmacht might suffer the fate of Napoleon's Grand Army, melting away in the Russian winter. Only Hitler's iron determination stopped the headlong retreat and destruction of his hopes. But even Hitler's demonic will could not alter the facts. Though vast tracts of the Soviet Union had been occupied, the ambitious plans of the summer had come to nothing. The Red Army had been crippled, but it had risen from the ashes. More numerous than before, formidably equipped, and led by a new generation of highly capable commanders, it would be a far harder proposition in 1942. Moscow had not been taken, and neither had Leningrad. The oil fields of the Caucasus remained out of reach. For the first time, the myth of the invincibility of the German army had been broken. Though few knew it at the time, the defeat at the gates of Moscow signaled the beginning of the end for the 1,000-year Reich.